Hello, comrades, and welcome back to Terror Calendar. Today we're going to be reading a pamphlet published by Novosti Press Agency Publishing House way back in 1989 entitled Names That Have Returned, Writing on the Restructuring. Restructuring, as the studious listener may know, is the English translation of the word Perestroika, the name of the reform movement that began under the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. Perestroika was an attempt, as Moshe Levin noted in his contemporary book on the phenomenon, to, quote, respond to the new realities of Soviet society, unquote. This included a depoliticized, bureaucratic, and oligarchic ruling party, which, since the Stalin era, had essentially amounted to an administrative apparatus of the Politburo and Central Committee. This created an educated but apolitical population, which in its turn created a litany of other major social problems. These political problems, in combination with extremely underwhelming economic growth that was unable to meet the needs of the Soviet people in general and its working classes in particular, each continuously influencing the other during the so-called era of stagnation from 1964 to 1985, made it clear that a reconstruction of Soviet society and culture along open, democratic lines, called Glasnost, or transparency, and a revitalization of the Soviet economy through its own opening up, Perestroika, was necessary. One of the most notable expressions of Glasnost was a radical reinterrogation of the Soviet past and the legacy of Stalinism in particular. The result was the political rehabilitation by the party and Soviet government of most of the victims of Stalinist terror, including the victims of the Moscow show trials of 1936, 7, and 8, excluding the former NKVD chief Genrikh Yagoda. Here we come to the subjects of this brief pamphlet. The Bolsheviks Nikolai Ivanovich Bukharin, Alexey Ivanovich Rykov, Grigory Yevseyevich Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, Grigory Yakovlevich Sokolnikov, and Martemyan Ryutin. I need not go into great detail on the lives and work of these outstanding figures of Bolshevik and Russian revolutionary history, as the pamphlet will do this for us in a series of essays published during the period of Glasnost in various Soviet newspapers, from the famous Bolshevik paper Izvestia to Voprosy Istorii, a monthly journal published by the Department of History of the USSR Academy of Sciences and by the State Committee for Public Education. Please excuse the mouthful. To go off script, so to speak, there is one more thing I'd like to highlight about this pamphlet before reading it. The title, Names That Have Returned, is remarkably similar to a ritual of the Memorial International Association, or simply Memorial, one of the most vital organizations responsible for our detailed knowledge of the victims of political repression in the Soviet Union. Since 2007 and until the closing of the Russian center of the organization under the 2012 Foreign Agents Law in December 2022, though in 2020 the ceremony was held online due to the COVID-19 pandemic, Memorial organized a ceremony restoring the names at memorial sites across the Russian Federation on the 29th of October, the eve of the Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Political Repressions, October 30th. During this day-long ritual, activists and volunteers would approach a microphone to read the names of victims of Stalinist repression aloud. I'm not sure if these phrases, restoring the names and names that have returned, are linked, or if it was common parlance to talk about the rehabilitation and rediscovery of those the Stalinist regime attempted to erase, to throw into the dustbin of history, as the restoration of their names. But I nevertheless find it fitting that the day of this ritual is just under 2 weeks away from the writing of this introduction. Without further ado, let's begin reading Names That Have Returned, Writing on the Restructuring. In the Central Committee of the CPSU, on additional measures to restore justice with respect to the victims of repressions that took place in the 1930s, 1940s, and early 1950s. In a resolution adopted on the above issue, the Central Committee of the CPSU points out that facts and rehabilitation experience accumulated directly after the 20th and 22nd Party Congresses, as well as more recently, prove beyond any doubt that in the 1930s, 1940s, and early 1950s, the practice of repressions and arbitrariness was used on a mass scale. Extrajudicial organs, troikas, panels made up of 3 people, and special sessions, both of which were specifically established for the purpose, and lists of potential victims, which became a widely used method of repressions against large groups of people, were the embodiment of lawlessness. Such practices resulted in tragic consequences for hundreds of thousands of Soviet people, exercised a negative influence on the country's social and economic development, and contributed to promoting disrespect for law and human life in society. The progress of Soviet society was slowed down, socialist ideals were undermined, and a serious blow was dealt to the prestige of the party. Restoring historical and judicial justice is a matter of tremendous political importance today. Success in forming a law-governed socialist state and developing social consciousness largely depends on this. The Soviet public and surviving relatives and friends of the citizens who were repressed look forward to the full rehabilitation of the innocent victims. The CPSU Central Committee has decided to request the Presidium of the USSR Supreme Soviet to consider the possibility of adopting a legislative act to rescind the extrajudicial sentences that were passed by the troikas and special sessions in the 1930s, 1940s, and early 1950s, and restore the good names of all citizens who became their victims. The rehabilitation measure will not be applicable to the traitors and Nazi collaborationists of the years of the Great Patriotic War, Nazi criminals, members of armed nationalist groups and their accomplices, persons responsible for falsifying criminal cases, and persons guilty of premeditated murder and other criminally punishable offenses. The cases of all these groups can be appealed and re-examined in keeping with the established legal practice. The Central Committee believes that in accordance with the law, it is necessary to accelerate the re-examination of the cases of those who were sentenced in the years of massive repressions. In accordance with the established order, compensation should be given for material damage, and the relatives of the victims should be located and informed of this. The Central Committee supported the proposals of Soviet citizens that special commissions should be set up in the territorial, regional, and city Soviets of People's Deputies, and the Supreme Soviets of the Union and Autonomous Republics. The purpose of the commissions, which are to be made up of People's Deputies and representatives of the general public, will be to help the Soviets in ensuring the rights and interests of the rehabilitated persons, erecting monuments to the victims of repressions, and taking care of the places where they were buried. Pravda, January 6, 1989. The current democratization process in the Soviet Union and widespread Glasnost have given access to several closed pages in the history of our country and returned undeservedly forgotten names to the people. Many of these names were obliterated by the mass reprisals of the 1930s, 1940s, and the early 1950s, by violations of legality under Stalin. Hundreds of thousands suffered in those years, some for having political views which differed from those of Stalin, others for their articulate opposition to the personality cult and their criticism of the deformations of socialism, and still others for their business, family, or friendly ties with the victimized, quote, enemies of the people, unquote. As it has now come to light, the preliminary investigations of most of the cases were falsified and conducted with flagrant violations of the law. The confessions of guilt were extorted by unlawful methods, and the non-existent anti-party blocs and anti-Soviet plans were simply invented. The Communist Party and the Soviet state have taken a principled stand on the issue. The names of many innocent victims have been totally cleared. The restoration of truth continues. A commission set up by the Politburo of the CPSU Central Committee is making an additional inquiry into the materials related to reprisals perpetrated in the 1930s, 1940s, and in the early 1950s. The USSR Procurator's Office and the USSR Supreme Court are thoroughly investigating the cases. As a result of this tremendous and meticulous work, names are being retrieved from oblivion. The historical truth is being restored, and the honor and dignity of unjustly convicted people reasserted. This booklet tells about 6 outstanding revolutionaries, 6 prominent leaders of the Communist Party and Soviet state, who were fully rehabilitated in 1988. Lev Voskresensky, journalist. You should know, comrades, Pictured is the nameplate of the Moscow News. Moscow News is a weekly newspaper of the Union of Soviet Societies of Friendship and Cultural Relations with Foreign Countries and the Novosti Press Agency. It has been published since 1930 in 5 languages. It is sold in 140 countries, and its circulation is 970,000 copies. I've always wondered what urged Pasternak to write in his series Volny, Waves, published in 1931, the lines, "You're next to us, the far-off realm of socialism. You, the country outside of hearsay and slander, are finding your way through the smoke of theories." I was simply stunned when I learned whom these most wonderful lines were dedicated to. Pasternak, a non-party member, a man generally believed to be funny in the head, who didn't write about Stalin in his poetry, in spite of obvious desires voiced at the top, dedicated his Volny to another outstanding party worker and statesman, a politician to the tip of his fingers, so to speak, a Bolshevik since 1906, member of the Central Committee after February 1917, editor of the main party paper and at different times, member of the Politburo, of the Central Executive Committee of the USSR, and of the Presidium of the Communist International. When dark clouds began to gather over the head of this man, Boris Pasternak deemed it his duty to send him a telegram, a letter, according to other sources, expressing sympathy, support, and confidence in the man's honesty. It was rather hard to mail such a message openly in the 1930s. This gesture, of course, speaks volumes about Pasternak himself and about Nikolai Bukharin, his addressee. After all, a poet is a poet, a person overcome with emotions. But let's think about the price of every minute for Lenin in the short December days of 1922, when he was lying in bed, mortally ill, about the price of each word in his political will, which had been dictated with great difficulty and thoroughly appraised, about his nearest comrades in arms and inheritors of his cause. It would seem he had to write only about business and political qualities, without any emotions, because there wasn't time for them. Suddenly we come across the humanly warm, cordial words. Bukharin is not only one of the most valuable and major theoreticians of the party, but is also correctly considered the entire party's favorite. The will did contain criticisms, too. We'll speak of them later on. But still, the party's favorite. Nikolai Bukharin's important role in the ideological routing of Trotskyism, as well as the errors made in the late 1920s, which he himself and his followers soon recognized, were mentioned in Mikhail Gorbachev's report dedicated to the 70th anniversary of the October Revolution. This was the first mention of Bukharin in 50 years since the ill-famed trial of the anti-Soviet right-wing Trotskyist bloc. However, there is also the other side of the matter, the judgment of a person's personality. It cannot be either too early or, on the other hand, too late, because both a personality and what people say about him or her are outside time limits. Once, not so long after the war, I got hold of a file on the Ogonyuk magazine for the 20s. I can still see the photo of the time. Bukharin is writing, "I'll stop smoking," on a pack of cigarettes, promising this to the young pioneers crowded around him. Like it or not, this was how I got my first impression, however naive it could be, of the man's personality. Quite a few years later, I was introduced to Anna Larina, Bukharin's widow, and Yuri Larin, their son, who was an artist. One feels strange at their home not far from the Profsoyuznaya metro station. When listening to Anna Larina's narration, time seems to get denser, and one imagines the events of nearly half a century ago as if they only happened yesterday. I came down. Stalin had come to see Nikolai, and they were having tea. Outwardly, I'd say their relations were friendly. Stalin invited him often to his dacha. Stalin also insisted that we move from the Metropole Hotel into the Kremlin. Ordzhonikidze was our next-door neighbor. I looked at the photo on the wall, a steep, high forehead, bright and glistening eyes, an open, friendly, and a slightly ironical look, and kind furrows above the lips. For some reason, I'd imagined him to have been a big, tall, and well-proportioned man, but in real life he was short, red-haired, and as agile as Quicksilver. He used to occupy high party and government posts, and being, as it was said then, one of the leaders, he remained an accessible, lively, merry, very sincere person who got easily carried away. On the opposite wall are two oil landscapes, two works by Bukharin which miraculously survived to our time. He exuded a current of some kind, or as we say now, he generated a biological field, and whoever got into that field felt involuntarily its impact. Here is another colorful psychological episode. Try to imagine the extremely hard spring of 1920. The Civil War was going on, the country's economy was paralyzed, and famine was looming large. The White Army was pressing all the time, and it was exactly in those days, probably at nights, that Lenin was reading the then just published book, Economy of the Transition Period, The General Theory of the Transformation Process, Part 1. And after reading it, wrote a joking review of it, making a parody, on purpose, of the author's over-heavy style. Today one regards this as a surprise which doesn't fit in with the textbook image of Lenin. What do you mean? A parody? And moreover, at the time when there was hardly any excuse for joking. Lenin's review has been published many times, and one can read it, but not the book Economy of the Transition Period by Bukharin. And really, it should be read. Let's say, for example, that nowadays we're used to talking about the building of socialism. But in the political vocabulary of the revolutionary time, these words sounded crude. Words like introducing, establishing, or victory of socialism were used more often. Bukharin was well nigh the first person to realize this, and wrote, "It will be necessary to build socialism. The existing material and personal resources are only a point of departure in development which engulfs an entire huge epoch." Quite right, Lenin wrote in the margins. No, it was not by chance that in those most intense days of 1920, Lenin deemed it necessary to find time to read Bukharin's book with such great attention. Let us go back to Lenin's critical comment on Bukharin in the already cited letter to the Congress. But his theoretical views can be called Marxist with very great doubts, because he has something scholastic. He never studied and never understood dialectics to the end. And true enough, he studied very little, if, of course, we understand studies as a well-planned course of academic studies. In 1907, he joined the economic department of the law faculty of Moscow University. He was by that time a Bolshevik organizer, propagandist, and agitator. 18 months later, he was arrested, together with the other members of the Moscow Party Committee. During his 4 university years, he was arrested 3 times, sent to jail in Moscow, exiled to Onega on the White Sea coast, escaped, and illegally went abroad. A thriller film could have well been made about his 6 years abroad. In Austria, he was arrested and put in a military fort. Later, he was arrested in Britain and in Sweden. He was exiled to Norway, and managed to get illegally to the United States of America, where he made a lecture tour. As soon as he heard about the overthrow of the Tsar, Bukharin hastened to get back home, through Japan, making a round-the-world trip, and became one of the leading participants in the October Revolution. But that's only the outside contour of his life. He also worked intensely in libraries and spent long hours thinking. At the same time, he carried on a theoretical, political, and organizational struggle against the opportunists, and worked in the Bolshevik press abroad. His research papers were published one after another. Yes, they did contain something scholastic, but let us look at an important postulate made by Lenin in the same letter to the Congress. His criticism of Bukharin and Pyatakov was made only for the present, and Lenin stressed that this would remain correct only if both these, quote, outstanding and loyal workers did not find the opportunity to increase their knowledge and change their unilateralism, unquote. How old was Bukharin in December 1922? On October 10, he was only 34. He was still to write books and articles, to fight the Trotskyites for a consistent fulfillment of the new economic policy, and to be elected a full member of the Academy of Sciences. He was still to make his famous speech at the First Writers' Congress, write his anti-fascist articles and the words socialist humanism, which later on became standard. And he was still to work energetically in the Commission on the Elaboration of the so-called Stalin Constitution. On the eve of the February-March 1937 plenary meeting of the Central Committee, he realized that he wouldn't be free for very long. Since he couldn't justify himself in his lifetime, Anna Larina recollects, Nikolai wrote a letter 2 or 3 days before his arrest. We expected a search. Fearing that the letter would be discovered, he asked me to learn it by heart. When he was convinced that I remembered the letter by heart, he destroyed the written text. I've been repeating these words like a prayer throughout the years in jail and in exile. I'm leaving life. I bow my head, not before the proletarian sword, which should be merciless and also chaste. I feel my helplessness before the infernal machine, which, using probably medieval methods, possesses a gigantic strength, fabricating organized slander, and acts boldly and confidently. Dzerzhinsky is no more. The wonderful traditions of the Cheka, when the revolutionary idea governed all of its activities, justified its cruelty to enemies, and protected the state from all and every counter-revolution, have gradually become a thing of the past. It was because of these traditions that Cheka organs merited a special confidence, a special honor, prestige, and respect. At present, in their majority, these so-called NKVD organs, this degenerated organization of degraded and well-provided officials who are devoid of any ideals and who, taking advantage of the past prestige of Cheka, pleasing Stalin with his morbid suspicion, to say the least, seeking medals and fame, are doing their infamous deeds without understanding that they are at the same time destroying themselves, for history does not tolerate witnesses of dirty affairs. How many times must Anna Larina have repeated these words? Recording them, I feared that the tape would break. Any member of the Central Committee, any party member can be reduced to nil, made a traitor, terrorist, saboteur, or a spy by these wonder-working organs. If Stalin had doubted himself, the confirmation would have come at once. Storm clouds loom large over the party. My single, absolutely innocent head will pull after it thousands of innocents. Because an organization, Bukharin's organization, must be created, even though it does not exist now, when I've not a shadow of a difference with the party for the 7th year now, and which was non-existent then, at the time of the right opposition. I knew nothing about Ryutin's and Uglanov's secret organizations. Together with Rykov and Tomsky, I've expounded my views openly. I've been a party member since I was 18, and the goal of my life was always the struggle for the interests of the working class, for the victory of socialism. These days, the newspaper with the holy name Pravda is printing the most heinous lies that purportedly I, Nikolai Bukharin, wanted to destroy the gains of the October Revolution and to restore capitalism. This is unprecedented brazenness. It is a lie. Such brazenness and irresponsibility to the people could only be matched by the next lie. As it turned out, Nikolai Romanov spent his entire life in a struggle against capitalism and monarchy for the fulfillment of a proletarian revolution. If in the methods of socialist construction I've been mistaken many times, let our descendants not judge me more strictly than Lenin did. We moved to one goal for the first time, by the untrodden path. The time and the mores were different. Pravda used to carry a discussion column. Everybody argued, quarreled, made up, and went on further, together. I address you, the future generation of party leaders, whose historic mission is the obligation to unravel the terrible mess of crimes which are becoming, in these terrible days, ever greater, are gathering strength and are suffocating the party. I address all party members. In these which are maybe the last days of my life, I'm sure that sooner or later, the filter of history will inevitably wash the dirt off of my head. I've never been a traitor. I'd give up my life without a second thought for Lenin. I was fond of Kirov and I haven't schemed in any way against Stalin. The concluding lines, as if hewn in stone, were, "You should know, comrades, that there is also my drop of blood on the banner which you will carry on your triumphant march to communism. N. Bukharin." He went off to the session of the plenary meeting and didn't come home. It happened on February 27. Anna Larina was arrested soon afterwards. Yuri, who at the time wasn't even 12 months old, ended up in a children's home. The verdict was read out on March 13, 1938. It is one of the verdicts which should be appealed against.